Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what happened in the early hours of April 9th, 2026 demands directness. What we are witnessing is not a tactical escalation. It is not a proportional response. It is not even primarily about the drones themselves. What we are witnessing is the complete collapse of a strategic assumption that has governed Middle Eastern security architecture for 3 decades. I am looking at satellite tracking data that has been circulating among American and Russian military analysts for the past 48 hours, and I need you to understand what it shows. What it shows is not a conventional drone swarm launched from Iranian territory near Israel. It is not a ballistic missile barrage. It is not cruise missiles hugging the terrain through Iraq and Syria. What it shows is 300 kamikaze drones, each carrying between 30 and 50 kilograms of high explosive, launched simultaneously from 3 separate bases along Iran's Caspian Sea coast, flying a northern route through Armenian and Georgian airspace, bypassing every single Israeli early warning system designed to detect threats from the east and south. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this represents the most significant intelligence failure in Israeli military history since 1973, why the radar architecture protecting Israel has a blind spot the size of Eastern Europe, and why your energy costs are about to reflect a reality that most governments are not ready to acknowledge publicly. This is the analysis you will not hear anywhere else. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by NATO defense planners and is classified at the highest levels in 3 different capitals. Let's start with geography, because most people do not understand where the Caspian Sea actually sits in relation to Israel. And that ignorance is precisely what made this operation possible. The Caspian Sea is the world's largest inland body of water, bordered by Iran to the south, Russia to the northwest, Kazakhstan to the northeast, and Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan completing the ring. It sits approximately 2,100 kilometers north of Tel Aviv. To put that in perspective, that is farther than the distance from London to Athens. This means that when Iranian drones lifted off from bases near Anzali, Noshar, and Amirabad on Iran's Caspian coast, they were launching from a direction that Israeli defense planners have historically treated as effectively impossible. Israel's integrated air defense network, which includes the Iron Dome system for short-range threats, David's Sling for medium-range threats, and Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 for ballistic missiles, is oriented primarily toward threats originating from Gaza to the southwest, Lebanon to the north, Syria to the northeast, and Iran itself to the east. Every radar installation, every early warning satellite, every intelligence asset has been positioned based on a single geographic assumption. Threats will come from the south or the east. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that everything you have been told about Israeli air defense superiority is based on scenarios that no longer apply. Now, let's talk about what Iran actually built for this operation, because the sophistication here is being completely misunderstood in Western media coverage. The drones used in this strike were not improvised quadcopters with grenades duct taped to them. According to reporting by Defense Security Asia and confirmed by Russian military observers who tracked the swarm via radar, these were Shahed 136 variants, each with a range of approximately 2,500 kilometers, powered by a simple piston engine that produces an acoustic signature so low that it registers on most radar systems as migratory birds or atmospheric clutter. Each drone is roughly 5 meters long with a wingspan of 5 meters. They are constructed primarily from commercially available composites and plastics, making their radar cross-section approximately 1 square meters, which is smaller than a goose. The Israeli aerospace industry's ELTA M2080 Green Pine radar, which forms the backbone of Israel's ballistic missile early warning network, is optimized to detect objects with radar cross-sections above 0. 1 square meters, traveling at speeds consistent with ballistic or cruise missiles. It is not designed to distinguish between 300 small, slow-moving objects flying at 180 kilometers per hour and a large flock of birds migrating north for the summer. This is not a design flaw. This is a design choice based on threat modeling that assumed Iran would never, could never launch a major strike from the Caspian region. That assumption just cost Israel its early warning advantage. Announcement number 1, Dorki Inalfrin, the northern radar gap. And this one matters more than anything else because it exposes a systemic vulnerability that cannot be fixed with software updates or tactical repositioning. Israel's X-band radar installations, which provide the primary early warning for aerial threats, are positioned at Nevatim Air Base in the Negev, at Mount Karen in the north near the Lebanese border, and at a classified location in the Golan Heights. These installations provide overlapping coverage of approaches from the south, east, and northeast. But when you plot their effective detection range on a map and account for the Earth's curvature and terrain masking, there is a blind cone extending northwest through Turkey, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. This is not speculation. According to a technical analysis published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in March 2026, Israel's radar coverage has less than 40% effectiveness for low-altitude threats approaching from azimuths between 310 and 350 degrees. That is precisely the corridor Iran exploited. The drones flew north from the Caspian coast, entered Armenian airspace at an altitude of approximately 500 meters, continued northwest through Georgian airspace, then turned southwest over the Black Sea, entering Turkish airspace near Trabzon, before descending to 200 meters and approaching Israeli territory from the Mediterranean coast near Haifa. By the time the first Israeli radar installations detected the swarm, it was 45 kilometers offshore, giving Israeli Air Force F-15 and F-35 interceptors approximately 4 minutes to scramble, identify, and engage. 4 minutes is not enough time when you are dealing with 300 targets that need to be individually tracked and destroyed. Israeli defense officials have publicly acknowledged that approximately 180 of the 300 drones were intercepted. That means 120 reached their targets. Received. That is announcement number 1. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the technical complexity of what Iran accomplished becomes impossible to ignore. Announcement number 2, the coordination infrastructure. This strike required an operational planning sophistication that most analysts are not giving Iran credit for. Launching 300 drones simultaneously from 3 separate bases, coordinating their flight paths so they converge at a single rendezvous point over Armenia, maintaining formation for over 2,000 kilometers while flying through the airspace of 3 countries that theoretically should have detected and challenged them, and then executing a synchronized strike on multiple Israeli military and industrial targets requires command and control infrastructure that rivals what NATO uses for large-scale air operations. According to testimony given by U.S. Air Force General Charles Brown to the Senate Armed Services Committee on April 11th, and I am quoting him directly here, the operation demonstrated a level of real-time coordination and redundancy that suggests Iranian drone operators had access to commercial satellite internet services for command and control relay. He did not name the service, but multiple defense analysts have pointed to Starlink as the most likely candidate. Iran has been documenting successful Starlink activations within its borders since late 2025, despite official U.S. export controls prohibiting service in Iran. The implications here are enormous. If Iranian military units can access low-latency, high-bandwidth satellite internet services that are immune to traditional electronic warfare jamming, then the entire architecture of American denial-of-service strategies in the region becomes obsolete. But there is something even more important nobody is connecting correctly. Announcement number 3, regional airspace cooperation. For this operation to succeed, 300 Iranian drones had to fly through Armenian and Georgian airspace for a combined distance of approximately 800 kilometers without being intercepted or even officially acknowledged. Both Armenia and Georgia have functional air defense systems. Both countries have radar installations operated by personnel trained to identify unauthorized aerial incursions. And yet, according to official statements from both governments, neither detected the drone swarm. That is the public position. The private reality, according to a leaked Georgian intelligence memo obtained by the investigative outlet Bellingcat, is that Georgian air defense radar operators identified the swarm 45 minutes after it entered Armenian airspace, tracked it for 90 minutes as it transited Georgian territory, and made the decision not to engage or alert NATO partners because, and I am quoting from the leaked document, the targets posed no threat to Georgian sovereignty or infrastructure, and engagement would constitute an act of war against a nation with which Georgia maintains diplomatic relations. Read that again. Georgian military personnel watched 300 Iranian kamikaze drones fly through their airspace toward Israel and decided that shooting them down would be more diplomatically problematic than allowing them to proceed. That is not ambiguity. That is not bureaucratic confusion. That is a calculated decision that reflects a regional diplomatic realignment that Western governments are not prepared to acknowledge. When a NATO aspirant country allows Iranian military assets to transit its airspace to strike a U.S. ally, that is not neutral peacekeeping. That is a verdict on where regional powers believe the balance of power is shifting. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The first story, the one you are hearing on CNN and BBC, is about Iranian aggression and Israeli resilience. That story focuses on the 180 drones that were successfully intercepted, on the relatively limited damage from the 120 that got through, and on Israeli Prime Minister statements promising retaliation. That story is accurate as far as it goes. But the second story, the one that is being discussed in classified briefings at the Pentagon and at NATO headquarters in Brussels, is about a strategic vulnerability that cannot be solved with more Iron Dome batteries or more F-35s. Think carefully about what this operation represents. When a regional power can launch 300 unmanned aerial vehicles from a location 2,100 kilometers from its target, route them through the airspace of 3 countries that either cannot or will not intercept them, and achieve a 40% penetration rate against the most sophisticated air defense network in the Middle East, that is not a lucky hit. That is a proof of concept. It proves that Israel's defense architecture has a blind spot. It proves that commercial satellite internet services can enable military coordination at a scale and sophistication previously requiring nation-state infrastructure. And it proves that regional countries are increasingly willing to accommodate Iranian military operations as long as those operations do not directly threaten their own territories. Israeli military officials have responded by announcing plans to deploy additional radar installations in northern Israel and to request increased intelligence sharing from NATO partners with satellite coverage of Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. This has not notably changed the fundamental strategic reality. You cannot fix a 2,000-kilometer blind spot with tactical adjustments. You need either to establish radar installations in Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, which would require diplomatic agreements those countries are not willing to provide, or to develop space-based early warning systems that can provide continuous coverage of all potential approach vectors, which would cost tens of billions of dollars and take years to deploy. The third option, which is the one multiple Israeli defense analysts have quietly suggested in off-the-record conversations, is to strike Iranian drone bases on the Caspian coast preemptively before they can launch future attacks. But that option requires flying Israeli aircraft over Iraq and Iran itself, which triggers a different set of escalatory risks that the Israeli government has so far been unwilling to accept. If you operate a business with supply chain dependencies that route through Israeli ports, what is happening in the Caspian Sea is not a foreign policy story. It is a risk assessment story. If you are watching insurance premiums for cargo shipments to or from Israel, this operation just added a permanent risk premium that no amount of diplomatic statements will remove. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta lasted 27 years. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides expended enormous resources. Both sides inflicted devastating damage on each other. And who won? Macedon, Philip II, and later his son, Alexander the Great, rose to dominate Greece, while Athens and Sparta were locked in a destructive stalemate that depleted both of their treasuries and military capacities. The parallel here is exact. Israel and Iran are locked in a conflict that neither side can win decisively. Every Iranian drone strike provokes an Israeli retaliation. Every Israeli airstrike on Iranian proxies or facilities provokes an Iranian counter-escalation. Both sides are spending enormous resources. Both sides are suffering casualties. Both sides are hardening their defensive postures. And while this cycle continues, regional powers like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and especially China are expanding their diplomatic and economic influence throughout the Middle East without firing a single shot. China just brokered a diplomatic normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran in March 2025. Turkey is mediating between Hamas and Israel. Russia is selling advanced air defense systems to Iran while simultaneously maintaining diplomatic and trade relationships with Israel. The countries that are not fighting are the countries that are winning. The countries that are expending blood and treasure on symbolic strikes that do not change the strategic balance are the countries that are losing relative power, regardless of their tactical battlefield successes. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths forward, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, containment and normalization. Israel accepts that it cannot eliminate Iran's drone capabilities through military force, shifts its defensive posture to assume periodic drone strikes as a manageable cost of regional security, and works with international partners to establish diplomatic frameworks that impose costs on countries that allow Iranian military assets to transit their airspace. This path requires Israel to accept a level of vulnerability it has not experienced since its founding. It requires acknowledging that absolute security is no longer achievable. But it is the path that prevents further escalation and allows regional diplomacy to eventually constrain Iranian actions through political and economic pressure rather than military force. I assess this path as the most rational but the least politically feasible given current Israeli domestic politics. Path 2, escalation to decision. Israel concludes that the only way to restore deterrence is to eliminate Iran's ability to launch drone strikes from the Caspian region by conducting long-range airstrikes on the bases at Anzali, Noshar, and Amirabad. This operation would require Israeli aircraft to violate Iraqi and Iranian airspace, would likely trigger Iranian ballistic missile retaliation against Israeli cities, and would risk expanding the conflict to include direct U.S. military involvement if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz in response. This path leads to a regional war that neither side can control and that will disrupt global energy markets for months or years. The economic cost alone would exceed $1 trillion globally. I assess this path as highly likely if another successful Iranian drone strike occurs in the next 60 to 90 days, particularly if that strike causes significant civilian casualties. Path 3, which I think is the most probable in the next 12 months, is an unstable equilibrium. Israel deploys additional radar and defensive systems to reduce its northern blind spot, though not eliminate it. Iran continues periodic drone strikes from the Caspian route, accepting a 50 to 60% interception rate as the cost of maintaining pressure on Israel. Both sides conduct covert operations against each other's infrastructure and proxy forces, but avoid direct attribution-clear military strikes that would trigger full escalation. Regional countries continue to tacitly accommodate Iranian transit rights through their airspace because the cost of blocking Iran is higher than the cost of allowing limited strikes against Israel. This equilibrium is unstable because it only takes one miscalculation, one strike that kills hundreds of Israeli civilians, one Israeli retaliation that destroys critical Iranian infrastructure to collapse the careful calibration both sides are attempting to maintain. But it is stable enough that it can persist for months or even years if both sides prioritize avoiding worst-case scenarios over achieving decisive victories. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, at what point does Israel conclude that its air defense architecture needs to be fundamentally redesigned rather than incrementally upgraded? And what will that cost in both financial and diplomatic terms? Second, which regional countries will continue allowing Iranian military assets to transit their airspace? And under what conditions might they change those calculations? And third, how many more successful Iranian strikes can Israel absorb politically before domestic pressure forces the government into a major escalation regardless of the strategic risks? Tell me in the comments what you think the Israeli government does if Iran conducts another Caspian route strike in the next 30 days. Tell me if you think Georgia and Armenia will continue providing tacit cooperation, or if international pressure will force them to harden their airspace controls. We will keep tracking every development in the Caspian region, in Israeli defense planning, and in regional diplomatic alignments. That is what this analysis provides every single time. Subscribe now if you have not already. Share this breakdown with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what just changed in Middle Eastern security. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update as this situation develops, and we will see you in the next analysis.